Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at some insights from scenarioDNA on how narratives shape the future.
Specifically how those narratives apply to climate change and brand innovation.
We're going to be examining how that storytelling influences things from public perception.
All the way to corporate strategy.
Where do we even begin with something as complex as climate change?
I think a good starting point is to examine how narratives play a role in actually forecasting climate policy.
Okay, so how do these narratives provide a framework to help us understand such a complex and frankly uncertain issue like climate change?
Well, you have to consider that narratives give us this framework for understanding things that are, by their nature, uncertain and contingent.
Can you give me an example of that?
For example, the philosopher Boethius wrestled with the concept of contingency centuries ago, and it's directly applicable to how we think about climate change today.
So how do these climate narratives then get impacted by broader social trends?
That's a really important point. Climate change narratives never exist in a vacuum. They are always being diluted or distorted by broader social trends that are happening at the same time.
Do you have any recent examples of that?
Absolutely. The rise of, let's say, anti-woke and anti-ESG sentiments has really muddied the waters of climate communication.
Right, so those trends are actively shaping the narratives around climate change.
Exactly. And to really understand those cultural trends and the narratives they generate, I think we have to consider subcultures.
What do you mean by subcultures? Can you give an example?
Yeah, let's take prepper culture, for example.
Okay, what's interesting about prepper culture?
Well, there's a segment of the population that's becoming increasingly focused on self-sufficiency
Okay,
and skeptical of government-led solutions to these global challenges.
that makes sense. So how are these subcultures impacting the broader climate conversation, especially in today's digital landscape?
Subcultures don't exist in isolation. They interact with digital platforms, and that actually makes their narratives even more complex and more nuanced.
So essentially, those digital interactions further amplify and change the overall climate conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
This brings us to a pretty fascinating example. Elon Musk and how his persona has evolved.
This is a really interesting example. scenarioDNA found a noticeable shift in Elon Musk's persona.
What kind of shift are we talking about?
Between 2015 and 2024, Musk's rhetoric initially championed this idea of collective responsibility and systemic change.
I remember that.
Back in 2015, the concept of smart cities was gaining traction, and Musk seemed to align with that narrative.
Yeah, so how did that translate to his brand Tesla at the time?
Well, Tesla Model S back then was all about sleekness, efficiency, and aspiration.
I see the connection.
And then fast forward to 2024, Musk's discourse took a bit of a turn.
How so?
He started to emphasize pragmatism, skepticism towards government intervention, and individual resilience.
So a much more individualistic approach.
You could say that, and we see this shift mirrored in the design of the Tesla Cybertruck.
It definitely has a different vibe than the Model S.
The Cybertruck was built to withstand a perceived volatile world.
Interesting. So it seems like broader cultural trends, like the rise of prepper culture that we talked about, can influence even the most prominent figures.
Absolutely. This transition from a caregiver to a jester archetype is really a powerful illustration of how these gender-coded archetypes and cultural trends are all intertwined.
And how those trends shape these dominant climate narratives,
Precisely.
which then influences everything from product design to public discourse.
Right, and this underscores the importance for brands, especially those in climate innovation, to maintain a strong and consistent narrative.
Because without that strong narrative, what's the risk?
Brands like Tesla risk losing their way and eroding the trust and loyalty they've built.
So how do they avoid that? How can brands engaged in climate innovation navigate this complex landscape and make sure that their narratives resonate authentically?
Consumers are pretty savvy. They can quickly tell if a brand is authentic or just following a trend.
That's a good point. So it's not enough to just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk.
Absolutely, and that authenticity has to be embedded in every part of the brand, from their products to their marketing, even their internal culture.
But with the rise of this anti-woke sentiment and the pushback against ESG investing, how can brands strike a balance between that authenticity and potentially facing backlash?
It's a tightrope walk for sure, and brands need to understand that narratives are not static. They need to evolve with the cultural landscape.
So how can brands do that?
Well, one approach is to tap into the power of re-enchantment.
Can you explain what re-enchantment is and how it can be applied?
Re-enchantment is about countering these often disenchanting climate change narratives with a sense of wonder and imagination.
Can you give an example of that?
Think about things like art and architecture that inspire a feeling of collaboration with nature, or innovations that evoke a sense of awe and possibility.
So it's about shifting the narrative from one of sacrifice and burden to one of opportunity and inspiration.
Yeah.
Which brings us to design. How can we consider how objects, spaces, and policies can embody these narratives of re-enchantment and sustainability?
We have to think beyond just messaging.
You mean the entire design ecosystem?
Yeah, like N. J. Rockefeller's Circularity Project, encouraging designers to consider the whole life cycle of their products.
That's a great example. It really reminds us that design has a profound effect on how we experience the world.
And how we interact with it, design can be a really powerful storytelling tool, conveying values and shaping behaviors.
So then how does this relate back to this increasing backlash against ESG investing, particularly from certain political corners?
Well, this backlash with some Republican lawmakers actually trying to outlaw ESG considerations in investment decisions.
Wow.
It's a pretty significant hurdle financial institutions are having to really watch their language and strategy,
So they're under scrutiny to avoid any appearance of collusion.
even if their intentions align with these broader sustainability goals.
So while we're navigating this complex web of narratives, how can we make sure that these stories resonate authentically and actually lead to meaningful change?
It requires a really deep understanding of these cultural and political forces at play. We need to recognize that narratives are not isolated,
Right, they interact and influence each other,
creating this intricate tapestry of meaning.
which is why I think scenarioDNA's work is so valuable.
Absolutely. Their approach isn't about predicting the future.
Hmm.
Using data and analysis to understand how these different narratives are shaping the world right now.
So instead of trying to predict the future, we should try to understand the forces that are shaping it.
Exactly. By understanding those forces, we can create more effective narratives that inspire action and drive positive change.
That's a really powerful insight. We'll delve further into these examples and insights in the next part of our deep dive.
Even subtle language shifts can reflect these larger cultural trends.
Yeah, like we discussed earlier, the backlash against ESG investing is a prime example where financial institutions are having to be so careful about their language.
Take the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, for example. They recently updated their website and added some disclaimers
What kind of disclaimers?
to make it very clear that their members are complying with all laws, including antitrust regulations.
It seems like a small change, but it speaks volumes about how sensitive these issues have become.
Absolutely. It shows how political polarization is now impacting even technical fields like finance.
Which brings us back to why scenarioDNA's emphasis on understanding these cultural dynamics is so important.
Right. It's about seeing the bigger picture, so organizations can anticipate these changes and adapt their strategies.
So it's not just about reacting to headlines, but more about recognizing those deeper cultural currents that are shaping the future. And this brings us to another important aspect of narrative, its potential to spark action and innovation.
Remember that concept of re-enchantment we talked about earlier?
Yeah, infusing narratives with a sense of wonder and possibility, especially when it comes to climate solutions.
Exactly. And we see this happening with projects like the Circularity Project, which is spearheaded by N. J. Rockefeller.
She's really leveraging her influence to push for a more sustainable and ethical fashion industry. And it seems like her message is resonating with both designers and consumers.
It's a great example of how storytelling can shift perspectives and motivate real action.
And how important it is to make sure our narratives are aligned with our values.
Authenticity is key. When we believe in the message we're sharing, it connects with people on a deeper level.
It's about moving beyond empty slogans and creating narratives that are genuine, compelling, and most importantly, lead to action. And that becomes even more critical when we're dealing with complex issues like climate change.
We need narratives that not only inform but also inspire us, narratives that can ignite our collective imagination and drive us toward a better future.
Speaking of inspiring action,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of design in building a more sustainable world.
Design is essential. It's not just about aesthetics, but about creating objects, spaces, and systems that are inherently sustainable.
So we need to move beyond that traditional linear model of take, make, waste and embrace a more circular approach.
Exactly. Designing things like products and buildings to be easily disassembled so the components can be reused or recycled.
It's about thinking through the entire life cycle of a product, from its creation to its end of life.
Right, we need to prioritize durability and repairability to extend the lifespan of products and reduce our consumption, and we're seeing some positive signs that this shift is starting to take place.
Like what we're seeing with the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and their focus on adaptive design strategies.
Yes, and organizations like Elemental Accelerator who are supporting startups that are developing innovative solutions to these environmental challenges.
So it's really about using design as a force for positive change to create a world that's both beautiful and sustainable. Which brings us to another important aspect of sustainability community engagement.
We need to make sure that these sustainable solutions are actually adopted and embraced by the communities they're designed to serve.
So involving communities in the design process from the very beginning, understanding their needs and concerns, and creating solutions that are tailored to those specific needs.
Precisely. And we can see this happening with initiatives like 100 Resilient Cities, which empowers cities to develop their own resilience strategies.
And campaigns like Earth Hour, which demonstrate the power of collective action.
Right. It's about recognizing that sustainability isn't just a technical challenge, it's also a social and cultural one. And we need to bridge that gap between experts and communities to create a sense of shared ownership and responsibility.
And this is where the power of storytelling can be so impactful, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. By sharing stories of successful community-led sustainability initiatives, we can inspire others to take action and show them that change is possible.
It creates a narrative of hope and empowerment that resonates on a personal level.
Exactly, highlighting that even small actions, when taken collectively, can have a huge impact.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the role businesses play in driving sustainability.
Businesses have a crucial role to play. We're seeing a real shift in thinking, with more companies realizing that sustainability is not just about compliance, but a core business strategy.
Companies like Hitachi, for instance, they're incorporating sustainability into their operations, setting ambitious targets for reducing their environmental impact. What's driving this change?
It's a combination of factors, really. Consumer demand for sustainable products is on the rise. Investors are putting more pressure on companies to demonstrate their commitment to ESG principles, and there's a growing recognition that sustainability can actually drive innovation and create long-term value.
So it's not just about maximizing profits, but about recognizing that businesses have responsibilities to all their stakeholders.
Exactly, to their employees, their customers, and the planet as a whole.
Which brings us to the important role of policy in shaping a more sustainable future. What can governments do to support this transition?
Governments have a lot of tools at their disposal to incentivize sustainable practices and accelerate the shift to a low-carbon economy, like implementing carbon pricing mechanisms.
So things like carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems that put a price on pollution and encourage businesses to reduce their emissions.
Exactly, and regulations that promote energy efficiency in buildings and transportation can make a big difference in reducing our reliance on fossil fuels.
And policies that support the development and adoption of renewable energy sources.
Right, that can help us transition to a cleaner energy future. But it's
Mhm.
not just about regulations and incentives.
What else is important?
Investing in research and development is key. It can foster innovation in areas like energy storage, carbon capture, and sustainable agriculture.
So by creating a supportive policy environment, governments can unlock the potential of these new sustainable solutions.
And drive the transition to a more sustainable and resilient future. But
Hmm.
policy alone isn't enough.
Right. It's going to take a multifaceted approach involving everyone, governments, businesses, communities, and individuals working together.
Absolutely. It's about creating a shared vision for a sustainable future and collaborating to make it a reality. And that brings us back to the power of narratives.
We need narratives that inspire hope and action, that challenge the status quo, and help us envision a better world.
Narratives that connect us with each other and with our planet.
Reminding us that we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable and just future.
And as we've seen throughout our conversation, those narratives are already starting to emerge.
Across all sectors, from fashion to technology to government name, people are waking up to the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for real change.
And they're using their voices, their creativity, and their ingenuity to build that more sustainable future.
It's a movement that's gaining momentum, and it has the power to completely transform our world as we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
I have a question for you to think about. What narratives are shaping your own field or industry, and how can you use the power of storytelling to contribute to building a more sustainable and just future? It's a question worth reflecting on, and I hope it inspires you to take action and make a difference. We'll continue this conversation in part 3 of our deep dive.
It's inspiring to see people like Indre Rockefeller using their platform to advocate for real change within their industries.
It shows how passion and expertise can drive meaningful impact.
It's not just about talking about sustainability, it's about taking action and motivating others. And that brings us to a crucial takeaway from our conversation, the significance of individual action.
It's understandable to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges we're facing, but it's vital to remember that every action contributes to positive change.
Even small things like being mindful of our consumption choices, supporting eco-conscious businesses, or getting involved in community initiatives.
Absolutely. Every step we take toward a sustainable future counts.
And those individual actions, when we combine them together, they create a ripple effect that can lead to real systemic change.
We can't just sit around and wait for someone else to solve these problems.
It's our responsibility to step up and be the change we want to see.
And this is where the influence of narrative comes in again.
Right? By telling our stories, sharing our experiences, and envisioning a better world,
We can encourage others to join the movement for a more sustainable future.
we can create a collective narrative that's compelling enough to drive real and lasting change.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought.
The future isn't set in stone.
It's shaped by the choices we make every single day.
If we embrace sustainability,
If our actions reflect our values,
and if we tell stories that inspire hope in action,
then we can create a future that is both sustainable and just a future where humanity and nature can coexist and thrive.
it's a future worth fighting for, and one that we can build together. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.